This series contains adult language and depictions of graphic violence. Listener discretion is advised. As far as mythological monsters go, what would be the Mount Rushmore? I'm struggling a bit, but if I had to decide, it would go, in no particular order, werewolf, mummy, vampire, and I guess Frankenstein's monster. See, that's where I'm not quite sure. Frankenstein's monster was purely a product of Mary Shelley's imagination, while these other monsters have roots that occupy a much deeper place in our collective folklore. Think about it. There are tons of different werewolves and mummies and vampires, but only one Frankenstein's monster. Only one reanimated zombie stitched together from spare parts that had major daddy issues and a desire for an education. But again, I think he belongs on our Mount Rushmore. Because really, what could replace him there? Some generic ghost? Meh. Cryptids like Sasquatch or the Loch Ness Monster don't belong. I mean, they're a different genre altogether. Maybe a witch? I mean, I'm all for diversity, but can a witch really hang with a werewolf or a vampire? Unfortunately, I don't believe so. And of these four monsters that have lived in our horror movies and books and ghost stories for centuries, there's one that has been blamed for more deaths in the real world than any other. Can you guess which one? Of course you can. The vampire. Welcome back to The Devil Within. You're listening to The Atlas Vampire. The very notion of what we know as vampirism or vampirism goes back to the early 1700s in Eastern Europe. The origin of the word vampire is Albanian, arising from the conjugation of the word dam, which means tooth, and pir, which is the verb to drink. Dampir. So literally, drinking through your teeth is the very definition of vampire. It wasn't until much later, particularly with Bram Stoker's immortal novel Dracula, that the world was introduced to the idea of undead beings that feed only on the blood of the living. From there, the legends and attributes of vampires only grew. It wasn't until the late 1800s that the idea was introduced that apotropaic, or preventative magic, could be effective against a vampire attack. Cloves of garlic, wooden stakes, Bibles, and other religious symbols that were effective if you happened to be fighting a vampire. Then other characteristics of vampires also entered the modern lexicon. Burning in the sunlight, sleeping in coffins, and the inability to enter a house unless invited. Oh, and they don't cast a shadow or have reflection in mirrors. Both facts that serve to reinforce the lack of a soul in a vampire. Before the rise of Vlad the Impaler, and we'll get to him in a minute, there were tales of blood-sucking demons going all the way back to ancient Egypt mythology, Babylonian and Hebrew demonology, and even Greco-Roman mythology. In fact, nearly every culture that has existed and left behind a written account of themselves includes some type of evil being that subsists on fresh blood. But man, leave it to the Romanians to step it up a notch. The monstrosity of Vlad the Impaler aside, did you know that in Romanian folklore, there's actually a vampire/werewolf hybrid? Yeah, it's called a pricolisi, and it's terrifying and completely unnecessary. It's a shapeshifter that, when in human form, is a terrible vampire, and then it shifts and becomes an even more terrible werewolf. If you talk to a Romanian, they'll try and water it down by saying, it's just a goblin. Don't believe them. In fact, Bram Stoker borrowed this myth of the pricolisi for his book, Dracula. Okay, so arguably the first modern vampire was this dude named Vlad the Impaler. And as nicknames go, this one is, well, it's a little on the nose for me. Officially known as Vlad III, he was the prince of an area of Eastern Europe called Wallachia in the mid-1400s. This region between the Carpathian Mountains and the Danube River would, 400 years later, become the country of Romania. Vlad III is considered one of the most important rulers in the history of the region and a bona fide national hero in Romania. Vlad III's dad was also a ruler in Wallachia and was given the name Vlad Dracul, which translates to Vlad the Dragon, after he joined the elite and secretive Order of the Dragon. His son loved the name and adopted it as his own after Pops died. There are several surviving letters from Vlad III where he signed off as Dracula. But hey, as we all know, you don't get to give yourself a nickname. My high school life would have been much more pleasant if this were not the case. So how did he earn the name that stuck to him like a Band-Aid for almost 700 years? Did he actually impale people? Why, yes. Yes, he did. After Vlad's father and older brother were murdered on orders from the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, it seems that the gloves came off. When Vlad III took power, he immediately turned into a paranoid lunatic and murdered every person he believed had not supported his transition to power. And not just murdered, he had them impaled. So the proper way to impale a person is to take a long iron pike, long, like 15 or 20 feet long, with a kind of sharp end, and drive it into the middle of a person's back on an angle so that sharp tip is pointing towards the person's head. A skilled impaler can get the pointy end to ultimately protrude from inside the victim's mouth and out through the head on the first try. Then the other end of the pike is rammed into the ground so the victim will be on display as a deterrent to anyone else who might think about messing with old Dracula. But it wasn't just the alleged dissenter that received this treatment. It was their wives and children, parents and servants. Up to that point in the Middle Ages, it was believed that Vlad killed more people than anyone. As ruthless and terrifying as he was, still considered a Romanian hero, it's no wonder that Stoker chose the name Dracula for his quintessential book monster. There was already awesome name recognition that struck fear into the hearts of history buffs, and then all he had to do was sprinkle on some of the more allegorical attributes, as well as make up a few, and boom, he's got a classic. One of the most enduring powers that Bram Stoker lavished on his creepy antagonist was the ability to shapeshift into not only a werewolf, but a large bat, and hang out at Lucy's window. Lucy in the book is terrorized by Dracula, sexualized, turned into a vampire, with Dracula visiting her every night to drain more and more of her blood before he finishes the job in the form of, that's right, a werewolf. Lucy is ultimately killed by a ravenous gang led by the monster hunter Abraham Van Helsing. But that's all fiction, you say? Sure. Any potentially real vampire attacks in the real world? Yeah, there are. Weird ones. There are a few barely worth mentioning, but for the utter stupidity and senseless murder carried out by the assailants. For instance, Roderick Farrell, dubbed the Vampire Killer, though I suspect he gave himself that silly name. He was a teenage, role-playing kid from Kentucky in 1996. Apparently, Roderick had friends even more fucked up than he was because he was able to convince a few of them to accompany him to Florida to kill the parents of his girlfriend. You know what? That must have been it. He was the cool guy with a girlfriend. To kill her parents so that she could become a part of Roderick's cool vampire coven. Not sure what the sacrificial death of the parents had to do with it, but then again, I'm not the one pretending to be a vampire. Yes, a brutal double murder ensued, and believe it or not, the cops caught this idiot and all his accomplices. As he was arrested, the mighty Roderick warned police that they would never be able to contain him because he was actually a 500-year-old vampire named Vasago, and they could not deal with his powers. Turns out he's not, and yes, they have been able to deal with him. Roderick became the country's youngest prisoner to ever be on death row. And in the late 70s, there was this guy named Richard Chase up in Sacramento who did some really disturbing stuff. He decided to murder, disembowel, and drink the blood of 6 people, man, including a freaking 2-year-old. he made some half-assed attempts to pretend to be a vampire, like saying he chose victims based only on whether or not their door was unlocked. A locked door meant he wasn't invited in. That's apparently a tenet of vampirism that Chase adhered to. He needed to be invited. And yes, he was arrested, tried, found guilty on all 6 counts, and sentenced to death. However, before justice could be carried out, he took his own life by means of a barbiturate overdose. But easily the creepiest case that concerns possible vampire activity is still unsolved, more than 90 years later. It involves a 31-year-old sex worker named Lili Lindström from Stockholm, Sweden. Now, this was way back in 1932, but police work and early forensic investigation had already been well established, so it's not like the cops were in way over their head. So Lili lived in the Atlas neighborhood of Stockholm and was believed to have been dead for up to 3 days by the time police found her body. Now, Lili wasn't your average sex worker. She didn't need to walk the streets to drum up business. She had a rather robust client list of men who would contact her and arrange trysts according to an agreed-upon schedule. The last person to see Lili alive, other than the murderer, was her downstairs neighbor. It was the night of the murder, and Lili knocked on her neighbor's door to borrow a few items before taking her leave with the words, "See you tomorrow." It was the neighbor who alerted police to potential trouble some 2 days later. And the crime scene was unique. The police found Lili completely nude, face down on her bed, with obvious blunt force trauma injuries to her head. What was unique about the scene was the complete lack of blood. According to reports, not a drop anywhere. Except, disturbingly, on a gravy ladle that just so happened to be covered in the victim's blood. When this fact became public, it was instantly surmised that the murderer drank all the blood from the victim's body using the gravy ladle. The killer was subsequently given the nickname the Atlas Vampire. Oh, another thing the police found were bite marks and saliva samples on the victim's neck. But the cops would have none of that vampire stuff. They knew vampires weren't real. This had to be a human person who just happened to like to drink human blood. No problem. Except, yeah, tons of problems. First, there was hardly any forensic evidence that at the time proved useful. Hair samples, saliva samples, again, from her neck, what? And used condoms. Now, with today's technology, that would mean that the bad guy would be in jail before the end of the sentence. But back in 1932, it was just a really weird collection of hair and fluids. A collection, by the way, that today resides in the Stockholm Police Museum. They needed to resort to good old-fashioned police work. They had Lili's ledger with the real names of all of her Johns, so they set out to find this whack job. However, after more than a dozen promising leads, they all, for various reasons, were conclusively ruled out. It was then that the vampire thing boomeranged. Public sentiment again turned to the supernatural, only now because this assailant was somehow able to evade capture in a manner that seemed otherworldly. Going on 92 years, and the case of the Atlas Vampire remains unsolved. In fact, they never even arrested a single suspect. Thanks for hanging with the show over these slow but also somehow super busy summer months, and keep a lookout for a few new series coming your way soon. Make sure you're following The Devil Within wherever you get your podcast to make sure you stay up to date on everything coming down the pike. You could also check out our socials at The Devil Within Pod on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. Until next time, stay safe out there. The Devil Within is a Cloud 10 Media production. Recorded live at Bel Air Studios in Los Angeles, California. Written and produced by Brandon Morgan. Executive produced by Sim Sarna. Our post-production supervisor is Bruce Whitkin, who also provided original music for this episode. For The Devil Within, I'm your host, Brandon Morgan.